As Professor Ahmed said, it is really a dream come true today. So I am going to give you a few words of compliments to my mentor, theoretical mentor I should say, that is Jonathan Kannur. You know, time and space, people may think are categories of analysis in sciences, but I would say it is the time and space that constitute our literary imagination. History works in terms of time, and geography works in terms of space. I am going to use this metaphor to compliment Jonathan Kannur. The history of literary criticism in the beginning, renamed later as literary theory in the West as well as off the Atlantic, Pacific, and of course Indian Ocean countries, is synchronizing with the biography of Jonathan Kannur. And I could remember in late 70s when I joined for PhD, the ASRC in Hyderabad was dictating methodological terms to us. What theory are you following in your research? And I was running around because we happen to be very poor scholars. We should get the fellowship. And I just came upon structuralist poetics by Jonathan Kannur. It is where my virtual encounter with Jonathan Kannur started. And Jonathan Kannur saved me from the embarrassment of finding a theory for my research. Not only that, he helped me to get the ASRC fellowship. How can I forget Jonathan Kannur? It is where it started. That is why I said the history of literary theory, people may say it is in the West, Anglo-American West, Anglo-American audience. But I would say, that is where I am coming to the second metaphor, geography. Therefore, the historical developments in literary theory synchronizes with the biography of Jonathan Kannur, number one. Number two, people thought when Jonathan Kannur was publishing, or rather, I'm using the word within inverted commas, mediating French theories for the Anglo-American consumption, please be sensitive to the words I'm using. They do have some historical importance. And this Anglo-American audience itself is a very limited audience. How come that Jonathan Culler has influenced Natarajan, a South Indian country wala, South Eastern nation wala? Now, Culler is sitting where? Is it on both sides of the Atlantic countries? No, he is available far and wide geographically. That's why that happens to be my second metaphor, space. He is available not only on both sides of the Atlantic, he has crossed the Pacific, reached the Indian Ocean, and now sitting in one of the southeastern countries in the world, India, and quite specifically South Indian state, that is one of the South Indian states, that is Canada. Now can you claim that Culler is to be owned by on both sides of the Atlantic scholars? And this far and wide spread Culler is a myth for us, is a legend for us, no doubt. And sometimes we would do rituals, harness to him in terms of that. And this is second metaphor, space, that has made Culler available all over. Scholars all over the world. And third, I am coming to his ideological significance. Again, I am not using this word ideological in the Marxian or post-Marxian or a simple dictionary sense. Because everybody has got their own way of life, their own ideas about life. That is what I call ideology. And this man Culler, when he was writing this book, literary theory, a short introduction. Look at the word, a short introduction. Where is the need for that epithet before that introduction? Introduction should be short. It shouldn't run into books. But he is giving an epithet, a short introduction that shows the urgency in which he wants to convey himself to us. Don't worry, I am not going to give you voluminous things like that. It is going to be a very crispy, very short, something like that. And in that introduction, unlike others, he hasn't gone one school of thought after the other, listing out. That is considered to be a kind of a high research. I get all over the world. Recently I came across a PhD dissertation submitted to the London School of Economics. I came upon that, I closed that book. He hasn't done it. The whole thing, because the theory was considered to be an interdisciplinary intuition into the portals of English departments at that time, 60s and 70s. And this man is dealing with these theories from a literary bias. When I say literary bias, it is not negative. I am not making a negative criticism. From a literature's ideology, his axe to grind was literature, not theory. And how best can we make use of theory to widen the textual space of literature? Therefore, this is what I call his ideological importance. And the third importance, as I said, as already I divulged, autobiographical importance. It is he who made me a student of literature into a scholar of literature. Right? My encounter with him, already I told you, it is not Natarajan's encounter with Culler. I represent an abbreviated version of all English scholars in India. We had gone to Culler for that. Right? Of course, my science is abbreviated version, that is different text. But I will come towards the end. And that is what made me, see, following Culler's structure, I won't call Saussure's structuralism. I won't call Roland Barthes' structuralism. I won't call Levi-Strauss's structuralism. I won't even call Marxist structuralism. They are all structuralists at bottom. But the bottom of my structuralism, it is Culler who has surfaced it. I had my own intrinsic structuralism. That is what Culler surfaced it. Hey, you are at bottom a structuralist. That is what Culler told me. That is what Culler ignited me. In terms of which, let me tell you, Kant has written more than 45 stories. From each story, I culled out one law. Like Dostoevsky, from each story of Dostoevsky, I culled out one law. And I put all the longs at the periphery, centers at the periphery. From out of all contrads longs, I got one primary contrad long. Like that I got from Dostoevsky. And now I compared the contradian long with the Dostoevsky long, and that is where I got my long of my study of both the two things. This is now later I came across, somebody has done this for Terry Eagleton. I was wondering why not doing it for Jonathan Culler. To that extent, I was influenced by flesh and blood influence. It is not influence for influence's sake, as it happened to a Marxian thing in certain countries. Real influence. That is it. Therefore, I cannot forget. I cannot forgive Culler for making myself what I am today. That is why I said it is an autobiographical significance, out of which I am just praising Culler. of course, it is a self-referential, it is a self-price. If I just, congratulate Kannur, it is congratulating myself. And last but not least, let me tell you, Kunya Ahmed, two things in my life I tried to do which I couldn't do. I couldn't pronounce his name rightly, even now. Therefore, I used to escape from this by calling him Dr. Ahmed. Right? And one more thing is, I just tried to be a little taller than I am. That also I couldn't do that. Right? And it is Kunya Ahmed who used to tell me, I don't know really what happened, because for me, praising somebody or abusing somebody is due to your selfishness. I am of that opinion. And Ahmed used to tell, sir, it is you who introduced me. 1 year back he booked me for this seminar, telling it is you who introduced me to Culler. Now Culler is going to come to our university, you should be with me. That's what he said 1 year back. I had some problem with Ahmed. That is again something no. But I immediately said, accepted that. And 1 year after, of course, it has got realized today. And it is Ahmed who brought me to Culler. And so far, Culler has remained only a virtual connection I maintained with him. And today, I am sitting by the side of Culler. Tangible connection. Not only tangible, touch connection. And this is possible because of your head, Dr. Ahmed, my student, Dr. Ahmed. Therefore, I am very much indebted to Dr. Ahmed because after my retirement I am talking. If it is before retirement, I must have got some axe to grind. Now retired, I am an empty band of case. Therefore, my praise or abuse will be less self-referential. Right? And therefore, I am very happy that Ahmed has made this encounter between me and Culler. And in one word, let me compliment Culler. Only one sentence. I just morning coined this sentence. I was very, very, very careful. In the interdisciplinary intuition into the discipline of English literature, Jonathan Culler has restored the old prestige of English literature to its original status, from its decline in its intellectual and institutional existence and presence and survival, and for which I am indebted to Culler. And last, because all my talk would be a little introspective with some silly humor. Towards the end, Culler used to be pronounced in India. Some would pronounce him Culler. I used to pronounce him Culler. Some would pronounce him Culler. Now, me being an abbreviated version of humanity, Culler, doesn't want to stand between you and Culler. Therefore, I am inviting Culler to deliver his talk. Thank you.
About that, I must say. It's very moving and extremely flattering, and I wish it were true that I could restore the prestige of English literary studies. Because I'm very great, and it's a great pleasure for me to meet Dr. Natarajan and to meet so many of his students here. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be opening this international conference. I want to thank the Vice Chancellor and, of course, Dr. Mohammed as the organizer, and also the Kerala Higher Education Council for supporting making my visit possible. So our topic today is the transdisciplinary humanities and the possible worlds. I don't have much to say about possible worlds, but I'm going to say something about the present and future of literary theory. As Dr. Mohammed said in his opening remarks, the humanities are crisis. This is true in the United States as well as elsewhere. Though the humanities are so frequently in crisis that it's almost become a part of their definition, practically, or part of their identity. But the crisis today, at least in the United States, is different from a crisis back in the culture war, what we call the culture wars of the 1980s in the US, when the humanities were always being accused of, and theory in particular, accused of subverting traditional values, undermining meaning, and indeed threatening to destroy Western culture through their critiques of received notions of social, political, cultural authority, and their championing not only of new ways of reading, but the classics, but whole new areas of attention, from the literatures of various minority groups to popular culture and cultural studies generally. So at that time, the crisis of the humanities, or what brought them under fire, was a conviction that they were influential, they were important to society, and so dangerous even, and too important to be left to long long-haired leftists or legalist professors. Well, the crisis of the 21st century seems rather different, based not on the presumption of the importance of the humanities and their cultural role in influencing the young, but rather on the presumption of their marginality or even irrelevance, sort of luxury. At a time of economic crisis, for many people they've come to seem some kind of diversion or luxury, forms of reading and reflection in which one may indulge, but whose social worth and contribution to material well-being is scarcely evident. And so this is not just an American phenomenon, of course, but occurring in other cultures that have previously set higher value on the humanities, in France and Britain, for example, cultures which did not experience those culture wars of the 80s to the same extent that the US did. So the source of this crisis it's not simply a resurgent American anti-intellectualism, the long tradition of anti-intellectualism in the US. But one explanation might be, I think, the general processes of democratization that have occurred in most industrial societies, and the decline in the value of what is often called cultural capital. Previously, one way of gaining access to elites was the acquisition of cultural capital, as we say, through appropriate schooling. Knowledge of art, literature, history made you a cultivated person, the sort who might indeed achieve advancement in a stratified society. So education was seen as in considerable part the transmission of a cultural heritage. And so education in the humanities was of particular value, more so than education in the natural sciences or the social sciences, though they certainly have their uses. But that situation seems to have changed. Whether democratization is the right word for what has occurred, does there seem to be the assumption, even in France and Britain, where the old valuations lingered for longer, that advancement and social advancement is really made possible by a store of appropriate cultural knowledge, being able to cite Shakespeare or Conrad or Racine, should we say. The expansion of media culture, first television, now the internet, and its gradual rise to a place of primacy among common cultural references has led to a situation in which people no longer feel they're lacking something if they don't have a knowledge of literature or art or history. So vast range of cultural materials have become widely available, and ready knowledge of, in the US anyway, of sports or recent films or popular television programs may be socially more useful than acquaintance with Shakespeare or European history, which might these days be found pretentious. So liberal arts education, once presumed to be the passage which opened broad career prospects, now needs to make its case on other terms. In that context, I think one of the dangers, and that's one of the contexts in which we can ask about the present and future role of interdisciplinary humanities. So I've long been, as you know, a champion of a certain kind of interdisciplinarity, the interdisciplinarity that has been characterized in the West as theory, his nickname. In my little book, I quoted Richard Rorty, he's already up there. Come there. Yes, I quoted Rorty that this is something that began in the days of Goethe, Macaulay, and Carlyle, this new kind of writing that was neither one thing nor the other. But I'm not sure this is the best genealogy. It's not my genealogy anyway, but starting, I mean, I think Marx has a role to play here more than Goethe or Macaulay. Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, etc. would be a good place to start for theory these days. But but I define, starting from that kind of genealogy, at least I define theory as works that succeed in challenging and reorienting thinking in fields other than those to which they originally belong. So interdisciplinary, transdisciplinarity, because their analyses of language or mind or history or politics or culture seem to offer new and persuasive accounts of textual and cultural matters. This immediately poses the problem to which the Vice Chancellor alluded of delimitation. That's one of the problems of theory, is that it's endless. That there are all these interesting writings from different fields, and the question is which ones are going to animate your thought, your research, and the absence of a general theory canon is always a problem. And of course, one of the things that theorists do is reactivate old texts and say this piece of work is really very important and we have neglected it, and this work can inspire us to new thinking. But in any case, the theory, in my sense, has in particular, originally it was exploiting work in anthropology, linguistics, and continental philosophy for its implications for other domains of study. Then later analytical philosophy, especially speech act theory, and then psychoanalysis, intellectual history, science studies, visual studies, contributed a good deal to theory, whose reflections became important for a wide variety of fields, even law, there's an activity called critical legal studies, inspired by work in theory. But architecture was so-called deconstructive architecture. But in any case, this odd genre of the interdisciplinary humanities has certainly contributed to the transformative potential of the humanities. First, by challenging commonsensical notions, whatever is taken for granted, taken to be natural in a culture. The Vice Chancellor mentioned the importance of analyzing how cultural traditions or cultural dogma have been constructed, partly the work of the historian, partly the work of the theorist, to show that these things that are taken as natural and inevitable are actually cultural products, cultural construction. And I'm sure you all have your favorite examples of dogmas that have been challenged. And it's here that it's easiest to see the transformative effects of work in the humanities and the challenging, in constructive terms, I'm going to talk about the challenging of hierarchical oppositions between man and woman, heterosexual, homosexual, white and black, oppositions in which the first term was taken to be primary, prior, and the second derivative, tangential, etc. In the United States, but also in the West in general, and not just in the West. There have been many striking changes in recent years. Emancipatory effects as political movements for women's rights, gay rights, minority rights, animal rights, for example, have drawn intellectual sustenance from work in the humanities. Feminist theory, gay and lesbian studies, indigenous studies, post-colonial studies, and other developments have contributed to extending the recognition or even rights to hitherto marginalized groups. You could cite path-breaking works, such as there's a miscellaneous series of books from Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, very important work. It's the beginnings of really a feminist theory in the West, and Butler, Eve Sedgwick, etc. A whole series of. I'm sure you all have your favorites too, but these are the sorts of books that seem to have been vital in transforming our thinking about various domains in ways that can be seen as transformative and not purely intellectual, shall we say. we seem to be making progress on many fronts at once, and the interdisciplinary work in the humanities seem to be playing an important role. Back in the 2000, for example, I would never have imagined, certainly would not have imagined that the US would soon have a black president, or that the US Supreme Court would allow gay marriage. But, so things seem to be we seem to be moving in good directions, but then of course we, in the past 2 years in the US, we've suddenly hit a wall, as it were. With the election of Donald Trump was a surprise, a result of overconfidence of divided progressive forces, and a blindness to the resentment of government and elites in general, in some quarters. And at this moment it's rather discouraging. There seems to be little role for studies in the humanities to play. Trump and his henchmen obviously pay no attention to intellectual leaders and show alarming authoritarian tendencies, and they've even thought cynically to exploit such notions as the critiques of such notions as truth in order to lie with impunity, even though the critiques of truth coming from the domain of theory are functioning at a much more different level of sophistication and complexity, and do not involve the denial of elementary facts. So there seems no possibility of persuading. Trump notoriously does not even read memos, or doesn't like to read memos, and so entrusts his instincts above all else. Reaction seems to have set in, and in part because those who have not been taking part in the developments of modern global capitalism resent everything done by the elites, especially intellectual elites, but also the media, but more so perhaps because Trump seems guided only by his ego. So it's a rather despairing situation where no one American certainly can't come before you and offer himself as an example of how the great things that we are doing are going to have transformative effects. I have to really come before you and apologize because, of course, the things that America is doing have nefarious effects on the rest of the world, and I certainly can't offer myself as a positive example. But I would be very interested in learning what you think of as the possible transformative effects of the humanities these days in this juncture. So, in thinking about this talk on recent developments in interdisciplinary humanities, I looked at a few recent books, anthologies that recent publications about theories, and I'm struck that arguing about whether theory is dead seems to have become a growth industry in the United States. Certainly if it were really dead, we wouldn't be arguing about whether it is dead. In any case, you get titles like After Theory or Theory After Theory that seem to be proliferate. And I think it's one problem perhaps is that the alleged death of theory is not easy to distinguish from the triumph of theory in some sense. If theory no longer seems a hot topic, at least in the US, it might be that today everyone realizes that their intellectual projects are sustained by theory. As the Vice Chancellor said, that those who think they are not guided by intellectual theories are in fact a slave to some theory they have not recognized. So their projects are sustained by and function within some sort of theoretical framework, recognized or not. I think the more widespread, the more ubiquitous theory becomes, the less it seems something new and distinct. And I think feminism, especially in the US, has encountered a similar fate. Feminists of my generation, the generation that really advanced feminist causes, complain that young women in the US don't consider them feminists or consider themselves feminists, although they take for granted all the goals and accomplishments of feminism. So in a sense, feminism might be said to have triumphed. On the other hand, is that the death of feminism, or when nobody wants to call themselves a feminist, or is it its triumph? So argue it both ways. Anyway, another remark. Before I turn to these, before I mention these books that I looked at, one of the effects of interdisciplinary theory is to have transformed the terrain of the humanities, and that it's as I said, no longer simply the repository of the culture of the past. The temporal character of that domain seems to have changed. When I was an undergraduate, a very long time ago, people argued about what was the best way to study literature: biographical criticism, literary history, the focus on the words on the page of the new Anglo-American new criticisms that were. But it was an argument about what was right, what was correct, what was the right way to do it, not about what was new or outmoded, etc. If something was said to be the latest thing, that could be challenged as not having stood the test of time. It thought to be important. Now, now we're much more attuned to the temporality of academic discourse. We're interested in what is new, what lies in the future, as your colloquium indicates, thinking about possible worlds rather than just about what the right, correct thing to do is in interpreting cultural materials. Part of this has to do, in the West anyway, with the capitalist corporate university, where universities are no longer thought to be simply in the age-old business of instruction. It's said, like corporations, it's said they have to grow or die, and lots of universities consider themselves more like corporations these days. They're supposed to attempt to innovate, to rise in the rankings, etc. And the fortunes of theory in the 80s and 90s owed a good deal to the fact that university administrators came to want cutting-edge projects and wanted to things that would get people in the newspapers, as it were, and didn't worry so much about soundness, even if they didn't particularly approve of what people were doing. If they were doing something new and exciting, that seemed new and exciting, that might bring credit to the university. But today it's hard to argue that theory or anything else in the humanities has triumphed. As students, and especially their parents, are vulnerable to the incessant, at least in the US, the incessant media celebration of what they call the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math. And the media has always been very suspicious of theory and frustrated that their former complaints had no effect, but now they have a chance at having their revenge, and they enjoy making jokes that English majors are destined for jobs in the fast food industry, asking, "Would you like fries with that?" It seems to leave the humanities as a domain to be defended as teaching about values rather than as an exciting domain of thought and research. And though teaching about values is certainly important, I think it would be a mistake to fall back on the claim that we just teach the classics of culture. What we need now more than ever is the most resourceful thinking about meaning and value, about mankind's place in the world, and ways of organizing life. We need interdisciplinary humanities. And perhaps we also need a better abbreviation of science, engineering, and technology, and mathematics. So the STEM disciplines should be, could we be the root disciplines, or the root disciplines, or the edge disciplines, the leaf disciplines, what are stems? We could be the flowering disciplines or something. But anyway, there's little doubt that as a result of the flourishing of what we call theory, undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty are now able to take seriously a wide range of topics that were previously out of range, just not on the table. And the relevance in literary studies in particular, or many other sorts of intellectual work, to what happens in our departments is really a new development. Something that recently as part of the history of theory. All kinds of interdisciplinary possibilities have opened. In an essay called "The University Without Condition," Derrida speaks of the commitment to theory as unconditional thought, thought that is unconstrained or is not bounded. So, and certainly its speculative character, its willingness to question what has passed as common sense, and to revisit axioms of our disciplinary practice has transformed the terrain in which we operate. And literary and cultural studies has taken to include not only a questioning of the canon and our disciplinary, but also our disciplinary assumptions and procedures and institutional practices. So, what about theory today? I mentioned that I looked at several books that give you quite a different sense of the terrain. Here's sorry, you're already, either how do I go back here? I must have touched the, yeah, is that right? Yeah, okay, so, yes, 3 books. So first this anthology by Derek Attridge and Jane Elliott, Theory After Theory, one of those titles that suggests the theory might be dead, but maybe it's not so dead after all. This is what that jacket copy says. In the back, you can see it. Offering an overview of theory's new directions, this groundbreaking collection includes essays on affect, biopolitics, biophilosophy, the aesthetic, and neoliberalism, as well as examinations of established areas such as subaltern studies, the post-colonial, and ethics. So this takes a rather relatively traditional view that what theory does is open up new domains. If you can name things like affect studies or biopolitics, then that's good. And these theories contest old positions. But so this, in some sense, retains the basic model of theory that we find in Derrida, Foucault, etc., and others, Butler, etc., etc. But it does, in this collection, it introduces some other figures, Jacques Rancière, Giorgio Agamben, but they say we should make, this book says we should move away from the idea that these major figures are necessary for theory, but note that the reason for having such big name figures is a shorthand for transformational ideas. So in this book, Theory is Not Dead functions much as before, but with some novelty which helps justify publishing a collection of essays. The second book is somewhat more curious and interesting. These were two young assistant professors, Theory Aside, and saying we're going to be different. Instead of asking what next, which is the traditional question that theorists ask, what is the new, what is the cutting edge of theory, they're going to ask what else. Instead of looking at the next big thing, the 14 prominent thinkers in this volume take up lines of thought lost or overlooked during theory's canonization, demonstrate that intellectual progress need not depend on the discovery of a new theorist or theory. But in fact, what this involves is, in these essays, is trying to bring back old thinkers who have not figured in the canon of theory. So Irving Goffman, who's a very interesting social scientist, C.L.R. James, who has figured in some people's theory canon, Ernst Bloch, a philosopher, I.A. Richards, at the origin of the new criticism, trying to be reevaluated as doing something else, Alfred North Whitehead, an American philosopher, and Alexander Veselovsky, one of the Russian formalists who no one has read for many years. We read Jakobson, we read Bakhtin, but not Veselovsky. So that's a curious idea of theory. We should go back and find neglected theorists of the thinkers of the past whom we can make part of today's theory canon. And then the next third is Vincent Leach. Vinnie Leach has devoted his career to chronicling theory and criticism. He's the editor of the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, and he's written a whole series of books. This one, Literary Criticism in the 21st Century Theory Renaissance. Again, writes, the jacket copy says, for more than a decade, literary criticism has been thought to be in a post-theory age. Despite this, the work of thinkers such as Derrida, Deleuze, and Foucault, and new writers such as Agamben and Rancière continues to be central to literary studies. Literary criticism in the 21st century explores the explosion of new theoretical approaches that has seen a renaissance of theory. So this actually, it's a set of essays, a lot of them personal reflections about his own engagements with theory, and a discussion of the continuing fortunes of Derrida and Foucault. It's not a particularly interesting book. What strikes me about this most is that he produces a diagram which you can't read, and it's very hard to read even on the page of the book, of all the different domains of theory, what he takes to be the domains of theory today. This is really the problem of delimitation, right? And then with each one has many subdivisions. These main categories that are there are these globalization. It's a strange array of things. Some of them are actually fields like institutional studies or eco-criticism. Some are sort of topics like globalization and affect studies. You notice the only presence of literature here is literary comparativisms, which is so strange. In any case, there's sort of an excessive, and this book for me represents this kind of excess of interdisciplinarity. It's sort of gone wild and trying to bring in as though theory is now encompassing almost every possible topic that one could study within the humanities and social sciences. And part of his justification for that is because there is so much theory out there, you really need to buy my introduction, his own introductions to theory, which he writes. There's a quotation. And that's what he said. He argues that the field of theory has become overburdened with new terms and approaches, creating a compelling need for maps and guides, which he is then going to pursue. So, part of my strategy with that is just to say, this is a field that I can't possibly cover or want to cover, and make you heave a sigh of relief when I say I'm going to only talk about a couple of topics under this very broad domains of theory. So let me first make a couple of observations about developments in theory in the West. For me, one striking aspect of recent theory has been a return to aesthetics, which for a while, at least in the U.S., was sort of a dirty word. It was elitist, etc., being pushed aside by literary and cultural theories of the late 20th century. Traditional aesthetic concepts such as artistic genius or the autonomy and universality of art, its inherent spiritual value, were inextricably tied to conceptions of the human subject, and the independence of discourse from social forces that theory of various times was engaged in combating. But without aesthetics, as Jacques Rancière argues, this French theorist, there is no art. Without some distinctive aesthetic values and perspectives, so-called art will simply merge with everything else into a sea of consumer objects. That's a very pertinent issue today, especially especially in the visual arts, where the connection between artistic practice and consumer objects seems to be very close. This is a book topic that's very interestingly addressed by the final book on that list, Sian Nai's Our Aesthetic Categories, Zany, Cute, and Interesting, which deals with both popular culture and high culture, and engages with a range of theorists, in particular Theodor Adorno, and Adorno's aesthetic theory, which she is working with and against. So Sian Nai argues that these three categories of her, zany, cute, and interesting, are familiar to us. They're trans-period categories, and that they apply to art of various periods, and that they apply to a range of media and genres, and they're both affective and conceptual, and they resist, she thinks they're especially valuable because they resist institutionalization and are valuable for their ability to help explain what she calls the remarkable smoothness with which supposedly resistant art has integrated itself into consumer culture. Cute and interesting as aesthetic categories. Jacques Rancière, as I mentioned, has been particularly important in reversing the critique of aesthetics as elitist. Western aesthetics, or what Rancière calls the aesthetic regime, has replaced in the early 19th century what he calls the representative regime, or regime of mimesis, inherited from Aristotle, a regime based on literary and artistic genres and structured by rules concerning appropriate or inappropriate subjects for art and for particular means of representations. So in the late 18th century, at the time of the French Revolution, these rules of genres were challenged. Henceforth, anything could become a subject of art and literature. Victor Hugo wrote that he had put a bonnet rouge, the revolutionary red Frisian cap, that put a bonnet rouge on the old dictionary that revolutionized the word use in literature. No longer were there noble words or ignoble words, that they could all be used in literature. Now, So that romantic revolution in literature and art was a democratizing project, and Rancière has vigorously reminded us of that dimension of art, leading to breaking links between art and the aristocracy, and to the foundation of museums and general projects of aesthetic education. Now today the question of aesthetics and democratization are connected with the topic of the new media, world of new digital media. Hypertext, consumer games poses new aesthetic questions, especially about our notion of art has been traditionally so associated with the finished artifact, the complete artifact, which is going to remain the same forever, as it were. Of course, but that no longer is the norm. Electronic form makes texts into immutable instances. We have performance art. We have a whole series of other aesthetic possibilities that are no longer focused on that norm of the finished object that will remain eternally the same. And unfortunately, discussing such questions is no longer seen as elitist or outdated. The second general observation, so the first was that about revival and its return of aesthetics. The second has been striking to me is the decline in the importance of psychoanalysis in the West, which for several decades was really central to literary study and literary theory. Everyone had to read Freud, and you felt you probably ought to read Lacan, though you would much rather not read Lacan. You avoided it if you could, but that was sort of this Freud, Lacan, etc. As with psychoanalysis was a major domain of intellectual speculation and analysis that belonged above all to theory, partly because it lacked any other proper academic home. Departments of psychology were usually not interested in psychoanalysis. They wanted to be scientific and do experiments, etc. Some of that intellectual energy, touch this thing by mistake. There we go. It's the decline of psychoanalysis. Some of that energy has been formerly focused on psychoanalysis, has been transferred to the domain of trauma theory, trauma studies. I cite Kathy Carruth's book, Literature in the Ashes of History, and into affect studies. Eve Sedgwick was a pioneer of the domain of affect studies. Xian Nai has a book called Ugly Feelings. Both dealing with dimensions of personal experience for which psychoanalysis might previously have been called in. Some of the energy of this that was associated with psychoanalysis has also gone into the field of what is now called biopolitics, stratagems and mechanisms of knowledge, power, and processes of subjectivization through which human life processes are managed. Foucault is sort of seen as the even though Foucault did not explicitly champion biopolitics as a field, it certainly owes much to Foucault. And I want to focus. So those were two observations about things that have been happening in theory. And I want to focus on two developments among many that seem to me especially significant. Whether they, the first, I can't promise transformational effects, but it's something of interest to me. The second is much more likely to have transformational effects. So these last two, then the first is the revival of narratology, which is theory of narrative and formal study of narrative structure, which was a major aspect of structuralist literary theory, but which for some time had sort of fallen into the doldrums, was somewhat neglected, not very dynamic, but has recently undergone renovation, making a comeback. So first, instead of focusing mostly on 19th and 20th century literary narrative, recent narratologists have given an important place to stories people tell in ordinary life as their fundamental way of making sense of experience, and also to a broader historical range of narratives, including medieval narrative, postmodern narratives, etc., which were not really the focus of previous narratology. There's also been attempts to draw on cognitive science in describing the operations involved in processing narrative as a major form of intelligibility. For me, it's too early to tell whether that's really going to give us anything more than a different vocabulary, or whether it's really going to provide new insights for how we process narrative text. And I'll come to unnatural narratology in a moment. But one of the most important books here is Monica Fludernick's Towards a, quote, Natural Narratology, which takes storytelling of the sort that happens in daily life as well as in fiction as central, and breaks with a, what's interesting is narratology previously sort of took plot to be the underlying armature, the basic structure was that of thought, which then you talked about perspectives and other kinds of things. But she breaks with a plot-based narratology. For her, something that can be a narrative if someone experiences it. So it's experiencing becomes her major category, experiencing. And she attempts to assimilate recent cognitivist work to narratology without abandoning the fundamental achievements of traditional narratology. Another work not very well known, but which I'm very fond of and talk about from time to time, is Rick Altman's theory of narrative. He is a French medievalist, but who also works on film, and so he's from a different realm of specialization than most narratologists who were specialists in the novel. So his literary domain is prior to the novel, and then film. And I think this is a very accessible book. It sets out to construct a new theory of narrative based not on plot, much less on the assumption that the norm for narrative is an unbroken plot thread, but on what he calls following. The notion of following is important for him. A narrative can follow one character, or it can follow a group of characters, or it can switch between one character and another. We have what he calls dual focus narratives, where you have plots, and multiple focus narratives. In crafting a narratology that's based on narrative in general and not just on literary narrative, he gives considerable weight to film narratives, and uses many vivid cinematic examples, and at a time when at least American students are more likely to know films than classic novels, citing film examples can be very helpful. I think that's a very interesting book. But in any case, but the most interesting aspect of this revival of narratology for me is what is called unnatural narratology. It's partly a reaction against Monica Fludernick's natural narratology. If you write a book called Natural Narratology, you should expect the young to challenge you. And in fact, Jan Albers, who's the leader of this, one of the leaders of this school, was a student of Monica Fludernick's, who was challenging her by promoting an unnatural narratology. Classic narratology posited that a narrative is a narration of a sequence of events, and thus involves a fundamental distinction between events, what happened, and the telling, the discourse in which they're reported, a particular point of view, for example. And classic narratology maintained that every narrative has a narrator, even if not manifest, and so it seems natural to say that a story is told by someone, a narrator distinct from the author, and that a story may either be fiction with no claim to truth, a projection of a fictional world, or non-fiction with regular truth claims. Now, narratologists have always known that there were many story narratives that did not fit this model, narratives where, for various reasons, we can't really tell what happened, or where the narrative perspective cannot be understood as that of a person, or where the borderlines between non-fiction and non-fiction are disrupted. And one of the functions of narratological models was to identify these anomalies. But as such cases are multiplied, especially with what we call postmodernism, it came to seem strange to have this narratological model that was based on a particular type of narrative. That why should that be the norm? Why should we not recenter narrative theory and treat narratives that fit a classical model as a special case of generalized narrative possibilities. So that's basically what unnatural narratology does. Special case narratives that follow a mimetic model, where the fictional narrative is an imitation of a real-world narrative, real-world narrative set in a fictional frame. So unnatural narratology stresses the anti-mimetic character of a lot of fiction, which calls attention to fictive nature in various ways. So there's stories, for example, like, I don't know if Robert Coover's The Babysitter is known here. It's a very strange story where it's impossible to determine what actually happened. There are multiple contradictory fragments of scenarios which it's impossible to sort out. You start out thinking, okay, this must be a fantasy of this particular character, and maybe this is what really happened, and maybe this is, but you can't, in the end you can't. You have to give up. You can't decide what happened. There are also narratives where with the narrative perspectives that are not that of a person. Wide range of possibilities here, as you know, from non-human narrators like a horse in John Hawkes's story of Sweet William, or you have Tolstoy's Kolshammer, for example. So it's supposed to be a horse, but it sounds like a person imitating the perspective of a horse, really. Or Samuel Beckett's, there's a corpse in Samuel Beckett's The Colloquium, or in Philip Roth's story, The Breast, there's a man who has become a 250-pound female breast. Rather nasty story, actually. Or the disembodied voice that narrates Beckett's The Unnameable, or Salim Sinai, there was a radio receiver who receives the thoughts of others in Rushdie's Midnight's Children. Or a narrative voice, if you can call it that, of Finnegan's Wake, which certainly cannot be identified as a person. So there are unnatural narrative strategies that have become quite conventional, from talking beasts in fables to so-called omniscient narrative voices. But unnatural narrative in general wants to stress the exceptional character of much fiction, that it's not realistic narrative stuck in a fictional frame around it. And then instead of simply registering these as anomalous cases, asks what is the effect of these unnatural strategies and how readers process them. And here there's a major disagreement between the unnatural narratologists who depend on cognitive studies and who want to argue that, whenever possible, to argue that the processes we use for interpreting narrative are similar to the processes we use in interpreting other things, and those who are interested in the unnatural processing strategies that fiction uses. And that, I'll talk about that, but I think I will skip over that. In any case, one surprising effect, once you start thinking about unnatural narrative strategies and unnatural narrators, is you can come up with things that you discover about fiction that you didn't realize before. So, for example, when we have extreme examples of character narrators, Marcel in Lost Time, or Ishmael in Moby Dick, or Nick Carraway, when they tell us something that the character could not have known because nobody was present at something that happened. So this is fairly common in novels, etc. But we should not assume in those cases, as a mimetic model would lead us to do, that they somehow are imagining it or lying or dreaming, and in fact we don't usually, but rather that this is an authorial technique for giving us authoritative information. So a surprising unnatural convention that is as highlighted by unnatural narratology is that when narratorial functions are operating independently of observer functions, something when you're being told in the narrative something that the narrator could not have observed, that instead of that surprisingly the narrative is reliable and authoritative at those moments, and even though in principle it ought to be the other way around. I think that is the way it works when you're told something that for the most part, when you're told something that a character narrator could not have observed, it's an authorial information being conveyed by a stipulating or a world-creating author. In any case, there's a couple of books of importance in unnatural narratology. John Alper's and all of the edited collection, The Poetics of Unnatural Narrative, or Brian Richardson's Unnatural Narrative, or Alpers has another collection, Unnatural Narratives, Unnatural Narratology, which I think is an interesting development, though, as I say, not one where I can promise that it's going to produce great social transformations, but it's reviving narratology in ways that are interesting. But the other major development, which I'm going to focus, is what one could call it's a sort of not a single development. It's a series of developments associated with the notion of the post-human, which we have so many possibilities under this. What these series of theoretical enterprises that really have in common the resistance to the anthropocentric vision of the universe that has for so long been a mark of the humanities, man as the measure of all things, as it were. So here we have both a range of interdisciplinary activities and an explicit concern with the transformative potential of the humanities. I think that if I were younger, sort of starting my career again, I would devote major efforts to trying to understand this array of developments and how they relate to each other. Because it's what's interesting about it, even if they all put themselves in some way under the heading of the post-human, they're often very different and affectively and even politically can be very much at odds with one another, I think, despite some kind of commitment to resisting anthropocentrism. So it's sort of a mishmash of different conflicting things. So, for example, an eco-criticism devoted to celebration of nature, hoping to find ways to repair the damage done to the environment by industrialization and other human activities, does not fit together very well with the treatment of the human being as a cyborg, as a combination of man and machine, and other kinds of highly computer-oriented things focused on the computer. It's a form of that questioning of the the distinction between man and machine has been a theoretical topic ever since Donna Haraway. Haraway. I don't have a slide about that. Donna Haraway announced in an essay called A Cyborg Manifesto back in 1985. She announced that we are all chimeras. We are theorized and fabricated hybrids of machine and organism. In short, we are cyborgs. So the cyborg, a human sort of hybrid creature of science fiction, part person, part robot, she wrote, can suggest a way out of the maze of dualisms with which we have explicated our bodies and our tools to ourselves. And two other strands of post-human are human animal studies, which explores and resists various ways in which we have made the distinction, we have constituted ourselves as radically different from animals. And last, the recent philosophical attempt to break out of a Kantian framework, which goes by such names as object-oriented ontology and speculative materialism. So attempting to think a world of things independent of us and our faculties. So let me say a word about the animal studies here first. The characterization of animal as other has long helped to define the human, but the question is, how is that distinction made, on what grounds? And with the question of the animal, as it's often called, the human-animal studies has become a burgeoning interdisciplinary field. Interestingly, some critiques of the human-animal opposition foreground the commonalities and continuities, that we are all fundamental animals. We can explore being with animals, which is must be already quite well explored in some Indian traditions, I would imagine. On the other hand, there's a powerful strain of recent theoretical work that focuses on the discontinuities between humans and animals, the radical otherness, the inaccessibility of animals, which we ought to respect, etc., and we cannot presume to understand, especially when we move beyond the animals whom at least Westerners like to believe they understand, such as dogs and horses. We know we can't understand cats, but we like to believe that we understand dogs because they seem so happy to see us all the time. We think we know exactly what they're thinking. Anyway, they're stressing the role that notions of the animal have played in defining the human. This approach demands respect for the otherness of animals and accuses proponents of the other approach of anthropomorphizing, of treating animals according to human models. There's quite a lively debate here. Human animals, commonalities versus radical otherness of animals. The undoing your boundaries between human and animal and promotion of respect for animals does go along with, or is sort of consonant with, eco-criticism, which undertakes similar critiques of the opposition between man and nature that help to construct a humanism in which nature in the West is seen as other and therefore our taking, therefore our exploitation. It underlies an encompassing ecological movement that challenges the anthropocentrism of humans, and that seeks to promote respect for the environment and all non-human others, the well-being of the full range of life forms, human and non-human, part of the environment as an end to which other purposes should answer. And potentially, this has certainly made progress ever since Rachel Carson's work some time ago, but in the U.S. anyway, in the face of a government that denies climate change and is cynically gone upset about undoing environmental regulations, it's hard to feel very sanguine about the prospect, about the transformative effects of such research and such theoretical movements. So I'm told that recent surveys of in America show that more and more Americans believe that climate change is real. It's perhaps if Trump says climate change is a hoax, and we know Trump is a liar, more people will come to believe that climate change must be real. I'm not sure. In any case, ever since in the academic domain we discover complexity, what makes the field interesting is it is not simply a celebration of nature. One of the arguments, of course, has been that traditional celebrations of nature still put man at the center, where nature as a place for us to restore ourselves, where we can escape from, where the world is too much with us. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. What do we see in nature that is ours? So what we should claim, Wordsworthian claim is that we should embrace nature for our own purposes in some ways. So do we save the environment for us, or do we save it for ourselves? It's easier to mount the arguments to convince people that it's worth saving for us if you talk about the flooding of coastal cities and things of that sort, and promotion of or do we strive to remain consistent in our opposition to anthropocentrism? Promotion of the concept of the Anthropocene as an era is the age since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when the irreparable human impact on the natural environment has become an inescapable fact of our world. Even that name puts human beings at the center. There's this age. Now we have a whole age named after us because the Anthropocene, it's really done damage to the environment. And this has led, for example, to the argument that there is no such thing as nature at all, that the nature or the environment against which human activity can be differentiated, right? Since any background, as we know from good deconstructive thought, right? We have nature versus man versus nature. Any background is structured by, suffused with our action, so that what we now call nature is often what has been artificially preserved or highlighted or is culturally celebrated. It's a cultural product as much as anything else. But to treat nature as a human construction, it is argued, then plays right into the hands of those who want to simply exploit it by obfuscating the material reality of the world that we want to protect and enhance. So when a theorist such as Timothy Morton, a slide about this? Everything seems to be stuck. There we go, sorry. There we go. And a theorist such as Timothy Morton argues that the environment is just a name for a flickering, shimmering field of forces in constant flux, and that nature does not strictly exist, the grounds on which to critique ecological damage seem to become weaker. So this is indeed one of the problems of theory. The more we explore these domains, the more complicated matters become. And it's no longer, from a theoretical perspective, it's no longer quite so simple as we can champion the environment. So the ecological thinking of someone like Morton can be related to object-oriented ontology, which I mentioned. There we go. It's rather small. I'm sorry, you probably can't see that. I'll read. Object-oriented ontology, which is based on the claim that nothing, no particular thing, certainly not man, has special ontological status. Instead of thinking of objects, especially even objects that humans have made, as there for us, they must be granted an independent existence, independent of human cognition. It's a matter of putting things at the center of a new metaphysics that implies that they do not exist just for us. That's a quotation from Ian Logos. I'll read it because you can't read it on the slide. Object-oriented ontology, care for objects. But can post-humanism really rigorously exclude anthropocentrism without reducing everything to the same? And what's sometimes called speculative, there we go, there's my thing, speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. What's called speculative realism is associated above all with the French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux, which seeks resolutely to oppose Kant's Copernican revolution on which most modern thought is based. Opposing the notion that we do not know things in themselves, but only things as they are adapted to our faculties. What would it mean to think about reality without taking as central the question of the relation between the world and our faculties? So Meillassoux calls for us to focus rather on what he calls the great outdoors, the eternal in itself, whose being is indifferent to whether it is thought. And that corresponds, of course, with a common sense metaphysics. The world exists independently of whether we can know it or not. The world cannot be contained or constrained by our access to it. And of course, anything we say about the world seems to depend on what we can know and whether the description that's why Meillassoux calls this a speculative realism, because it's speculative. There's no way for us to know things outside of our own capabilities of knowing. So we can speculate about what we could say about the world if there weren't any people around, should we say? Or what would be without people? In any case, so there's certainly affinities between this and the book down here at the bottom. Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter is a book that's been much discussed recently in the U.S. Vibrant Matter, a political ecology of things, which advances the concept of distributed agency and stresses the range of ways in which non-human actors participate in events, not just as objects of our will, but as compliant or resistant actors. So it's a controversial book that rereads some of the history of philosophy in ways that are seen as stressing sort of almost magical or mysterious forces. But it can be consonant with versions of eco-criticism and that resists separations of man from environment, as in Bruno Latour's actor network theory, which insists that living in the world we're part of systems of distributed cognition, some of it embedded in our minds and some in natural systems. And this is connected with, I mentioned Donna Haraway on the cyborg. This is connected with a more technologically oriented strand of post-human thought, as in Catherine Hale's How We Became Post-Human, which charts a shift in understanding of the human from autonomous subjects to we're sort of nodes of embodiment in increasingly complex systems with feedback loops. The systems of which we form a part are now able to fly. When you have a pilot flying an airplane, the human pilot is sort of part of this larger system in which is in charge. The systems that sort of in interaction with humans, fly airplanes, set stock prices, find information, do a host of other things. When we are searching for something on the internet, we are we're performing an action, they're part of an elaborate system of feedback loops, etc. So these are, though for many purposes we still have recourse to traditional notions of individuals, free will, and agency, these are seen as, in this type of post-human thinking, as these are sort of heuristic fictions that we use to try to make sense of a world in which patterns emerge against a background of randomness through recursive operations. Well, the notion of post-human, which I think of as above all an intention-getting device, since we're still around, but we're supposed to be post-human, is a logical development of movements of contemporary theory, which has contested the traditional model of the human subject as autonomous, rational, self-conscious, possessed of free will. But fundamental claim is that we have always been post-human, always other than that image of the human suggested by humanism. That computers and other devices have only made evident what was the case all along. That, for example, the human psyche with its drives was never something that we controlled. And our bodies are extremely complex mechanisms that have always, in many ways, escaped our understanding. So, in any case, these are among the recent movements in contemporary theory that look as though they will have further developments, and we can speculate about the kinds of transformative effects they might have. One point to stress is that human-animal studies and eco-criticism in particular are not just theoretical movements, but also political movements driven by a commitment to justice. So, for example, after women's liberation and gay liberation, there's a certain logic contesting hierarchical oppositions might point toward animal liberation, and certainly there are movements in the states that are working against different kinds of inhuman treatment of animals and exploitation of animals in research and that sort of thing. But at what point does this theoretical reflection become counterproductive? Do we really want to champion machine liberation, for example? An ontology that insists on the democracy of all objects may be resistant to many of the goals we want to defend. If you have these lists that the writer bonobos, buttons, bacteria, bulldozers, etc., are all equally worthy of our care, is that where we want to invest our energy? So the question of the relationship between theoretical explorations and the causes that many of what's the relationship between these explanations and the causes that may have helped instigate them. So, but whatever happens, I feel confident that there will be continue to be an active, engaging, interdisciplinary theoretical enterprise that is highly germane to literary and cultural studies. And there's no doubt that interdisciplinarity, with its new objects of study, will how many things are there that we now think of as having a history, which we didn't before, is central. But okay, the question of what sort of transformational effects are possible. It's very hard to predict in an increasingly polarized political world with the emergence of populist demagoguery everywhere. It's tempting to say that our job is to keep the faith in reason and analysis, educating the young, etc. In a lecture at Stanford entitled "The University Without Conditions," Derrida affirmed his faith in the university and in the humanities of tomorrow, insofar as universities are in principle committed to unconditional freedom of investigation and questioning, and where humanities in particular are the sites of this research and reflection without presupposition. Everything that concerns the question and the history of truth and its relations to the question of man, what is proper to man, of human rights, of crimes against humanity, and so forth, must in principle find its space of unconditional discussion without presuppositions, and so as to find the best access to a new public space transformed by new techniques of communication, information, archivization, and knowledge production. Of course, as we've recently learned, new techniques of communication are a dangerous force as well as opportunity, more easily harnessed for fake news and spread of bigotry than for humanistic reflection and humanistic reflection and discovery. Indeed, it's not clear how far this is a major problem. Of course, we've not really learned to use these media to advance our causes. Derrida, speaking of deconstruction as the unconditional right to raise critical questions, even about the nature of critique itself, in this lecture set out a series of propositions of proposals for the humanities. The first, as some of those in that quotation, the history of man, what is proper to man, and of the rights of man, not forgetting the animal. Second, the history of democracy, the idea of sovereignty, how to dissociate the idea of the citizen from the nation state and sovereignty. And then the history of the concept of the institution of literature as the right to say everything, say anything. And finally, the exploration of the nature of the event. It concludes with a call for work in the humanities to be a work of resistance, he says. In order to resist effectively, work of resistance, in order to resist effectively by allying itself with extra academic forces, in order to organize an inventive resistance through its works, to all inventive resistance to all attempts at reappropriation of all other figures of sovereignty. Take your time, concludes, but be quick about it, because you do not know what awaits you. That's indeed, we did not, and we still do not. Thank you very much.
Graphical account of books on theories, books on theories on theories, books on theories on books, books on the canonization of theories, theories of canonization, books on theories of exhaustion, books on theories of exhaustion or exhaustion of theories. See, I am trying my level best to summarize him. Books on counter theories. Let us have books on return to aesthetics. Is it a solution to go beyond theories? And this return to aesthetics, what kind of aesthetics? Is it natural aesthetics or unnatural aesthetics? Tom-tomming the death of the narrator, not the author. Death of that? Once upon a time, author was mutilated into narrator. Narrator was mutilated into unreliable narrator. Now we are tom-tomming the death of narrator. Right? All this round that no. We look at things from all possible points of view. That is why growth is possible. Growth remains truncated and it must be open. And towards the end, I am very happy he wound up his lecture with a book by Derrida, A University Without Conditions, which anticipated the birth of new humanities. And therefore, it's a beautiful historical theoretical account of books. That's where I just have given a word for that, an annotated bibliographical account. An annotated bibliographical account. It was quite nice. It is not just a cardboard historical account of the publication of books dealing with the contemporary issues in the West, but a theoretical account of. That is where Culler is known for. Culler is known for. He would never be happy with giving a cardboard account of books, but a theoretical account of books. That is very difficult for us to do that. That's why I thanked him in the morning. Therefore, such a beautiful lecture he has given. Now everything is open for discussion, and your questions, if they are legible, directly he will answer. Otherwise, it will be mediated by no less a person than Dr. Ahmed. Okay?
I wanted to ask you something about what you said. Like you said, there was this trend of innovating in humanities departments, innovating so that. But then, wouldn't these innovating have to follow a template of the corporate industry, which the corporate industry seems to welcome the innovations. You said that. So wouldn't it be, wouldn't it have to follow or fall into this framework that the corporate industry provides?
Thank you. Yes, did people in the back hear the question? Should I repeat it? It's about the corporate university in America. I had claimed that I thought that the sort of change in the idea of the university had helped to make it possible for theory to flourish, even though the things theorists were doing might not seem sound or right or to administrators. They were happy to, if people were publishing books and winning grants and being invited to give distinguished lectures and things of that sort, the administrators were happy, even if they thought that this was a lot of nonsense. As your Vice Chancellor said, he is a historian, not in the field of literary theory, and at some level he's worried about theory. On the other hand, he is happy to promote a lecture by a dubious postmodern theorist on new developments, because it helps bring credit to the university, and I think that was the sort of thing that's happening. So I mentioned corporate university. That that's a phrase we use in America, just because our universities, many of them, especially the elite universities, are private. But they are increasingly run by people who are not really professors, but who are professional administrators and who are interested in budgets and student numbers, and they want. So I think the pressure from the central administrations on the humanities these days in the U.S. anyway, it does not really concern the content of our courses or our research. It concerns, are we doing things that will attract enough students, especially at tuition-paying universities. You want students who, if you have large classes, then they will give you more funding for new professors, for example.
Even if it is critical to this industry?
Yes, I think even so. Yes, I think that they don't really care very much about the content of what's happening. They're eager to. In principle, they espouse notions of disciplinary responsibility. So what we are doing, for example, for promotions and tenure, there are always professors from outside the university who are consulted, who are experts in the field, and if they approve of the things that professors in this university are doing, the administrators will be happy to go along with the promotion, even if it's something that they don't understand or don't care about. So,
very foolish of them.
Yes. So it may be different in, here you have more centralized system, and certainly in France, for example, there's a very highly centralized system. There's a considerable disconnection between the work that is being done. I mean, someone like Derrida never fit into the French university at all. So the programs are established centrally by government agencies, and so the work professors are doing may be completely detached. Whereas we are fortunate, at least in the American university, in having a fair amount of autonomy, and the Department of English there are no requirements imposed upon us from above by the administration, as long as what we are doing attracts a reasonable number of students.
I think a related issue that comes to my mind is the impact of private organizations like the Koch brothers in the States, because they have their own institutes of humanities that actually promote their own political agenda. They have professors, and Koch brothers are actually notorious for their affiliation to Trump and the others, but they're running institutions, humanities institutions in the States. What kind of impact do they have? I mean,
yeah, I think for the most part, the political organizations and political parties don't care very much about don't worry very much about the humanities these days. That was a shift from, as I say, back in the 80s, there were these, what we call these culture wars, where the humanities were being accused of destroying Western culture and undermining values, and where there was certainly people would write editorials saying that university administrators should clamp down on these activities, and there certainly are some institutions that there's first, one of the most notorious is the Hoover Institute at Stanford, which is a right wing. They're mostly concerned with political science and rather than actually the humanities itself. But, so I think most of the humanities centers in universities are generally run by humanities professors without much extra funding from corporate sources. There are also, we have a range of foundations that support activities in the humanities. The Mellon Foundation is the biggest and the most, with the Ford Foundation, etc. But most of these are actually the foundations that are actively supporting the humanities are mostly quite liberal in their outlooks, and especially the Ford Foundation, for example, has been very active in trying to promote racial equality and global programs to alleviate hunger or disease, etc., in the third world and things of that sort. There certainly are some right-wing foundations which have funded lecture series that are supposed to inculcate the proper values, but those are fairly rare. It's partly mostly they think we're irrelevant, I think, rather than dangerous. So the right-wing funders do not meddle with us very much.
Sir, I greatly admire your exposure.
Thank you.
The kind of information which you have shared with us. And with reference to what you said about your experiences, US as a corporate university, I would also like to say, to some extent, I would also like to say that to a great extent, India also has become a corporate university, public polity. So the experience is more or less the same, or is becoming the same. Now, let that be so. Now, my main question is this, that is, since you have mentioned several kinds of shifts from, say, cultural materialism to speculative materialism, from humanism to post-humanism, from the human to the Anthropocene, again from ecology to ecology without nature, and the like. And this is what is happening. So now specifically, what are the pedagogical challenges which you experienced, or what are, generally speaking, the pedagogical challenges involved in teaching theory now? Because personally, I experienced this to some extent when I was addressing my students at the MPhil level. When I was mentioning them about the significance of post-humanities. So students who were sort of fixed in the Arnoldian tradition, even now it's rather shocking that many institutions, many academics continue to be in the Arnoldian tradition. So those who are trained in the Arnoldian tradition find it rather shocking when we talk about post-humanities or transformative humanities and the kind of shifts that has taken place. So what is, I would like to know your response to this, whether something like that is there in your case also as a teacher in the academic.
Thank you. Yes, very good questions. First, a remark about the corporate university. I don't know about the situation in India, but I think one of the curious features of the American system with private universities, especially the elite universities, Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, etc., is that it is again, very different from France. They really see themselves as in competition with each other in some sense, just as corporations are competing for market share or visibility of their brands. And that has been worked to the advantage of theorists, because if there's someone like Judith Butler, who universities would like to hire her and because she would bring distinction to their faculty. So the universities are trying to hire, they compete with each other to hire faculty who have made themselves prominent through theory, even if the university doesn't necessarily believe very much in theory. And that is
20 plus private universities have come up in India, where they are now introducing this tenure system and all those things.
I see. So that's
And
when that may come to.
yeah.
Oh yeah, that's, and as I say, that hasn't been. We are, many of my colleagues complain all the time about the corporate university that we are ruled by people who don't really care about education, but just about budgets and that sort, which is perhaps true. On the other hand, the structure of universities competing for each other has actually, in my view, been good for theory because it's the things that are visible, activities that are visible, attract the universities, and they want to hire more people who do this sort of thing. In any case, but to come to the question of more important question of pedagogical difficulties, I think that the major problem teaching theory is one that the Vice Chancellor mentioned before. It's just such a vast field, and especially if we are interested in recent developments, the problem would be that the students haven't read the older work on which these things are often based. So the Vice Chancellor mentioned Marx, and it would be good if everyone had read Marx and Freud and Nietzsche, etc., before we start working on other newer 21st century things, but they usually haven't, so you have to make decisions about that. What are you going to be focusing on? Current new texts, or are you going to go try to give them a foundation of some sort in earlier? And it's also would be good for students to have read Aristotle with them. So it's just the range of theory is just too big. So that's the major decision. But I think coming to your question about the Arnoldian assumptions of faculty, or I don't know if it was colleagues or also the students, I think that one problem that many teachers have in teaching theory is that they come into the classroom eager to explode the presuppositions of the students who they imagine will have believe that a work of art is it should be a unified whole, etc. And then they discover that these students don't actually have any of these traditional assumptions, that we want to explode the notions that they have taken for granted, but they don't actually take them for granted. So it becomes a little bit, you think you're going to be working against a set of presumptions, and you find that the presumptions aren't there, so you have to teach them that, people used to say, new criticism always said this about the work of art, and yet we think that's not right. So, but that doesn't work very well. They're happy to say, okay, well, I don't believe it's right, so who cares? So you work trying to, especially for those of us who are older and who have not grown up in a world of video, where I used to, when teaching narratology, have a sense that students expected stories to have a beginning, middle, and then the end, and to be coherent in various ways. But if you're a video game player, you know that stories can go off in all kinds of different directions. You're always creating these strange loops, and so the older notions of narrative don't hold for them. So in principle, this could be an opportunity. But for those of us who don't share the students' knowledge and understanding of the world and of media, it becomes difficult. So it's more a problem of us not knowing what the students already know and assume, I think, than anything else. But yes, it is. This difficulty. Our graduate students teach have courses, intensive writing courses for freshmen in small groups. They teach them, and there's some content, but it's basically a writing-focused course. And so our graduate students are very eager. This is going to be their first teaching opportunity, and they're very eager to get in there and explode, teach against racism and sexism and homophobia and all that. So do all the political work that they want to do, and then they find that the students don't actually. They're not particularly interested in it because they don't necessarily already have those assumptions that the graduate students are. Because the undergraduates are only a few years younger than the graduate students. They don't necessarily have the assumptions that the graduate students are very eager to combat and make themselves very politically effective.
I'd like to.
You can come here.
Yeah, I'd like to make an observation. In your book, The Pursuit of Science, there's a section on the graduate program, English graduate program, where you say that there are concerns about shrinking enrollments, declining enrollment situations and shrinking job prospects and dwindling funding system, as far as the humanities is concerned. But in fact, in India, we don't have the problem in the English department. English, not because we have too many teachers' jobs available, it's not just that, there are a number of other factors, but it's just an observation that when I went through that section where you talk about how the English programs are actually, directors of English programs are forced to count the number of students they get and so on and so forth. We get a lot of students, and probably it has something to do with the demographic, I think something to do with the population, but it's totally different.
I think that's true. Yes, one of our problems in the American university is that undergraduates are simply accepted as students at the university, by the university, they don't commit to a subjects of study initially, at the moment of admission. And so then the different departments we are sort of competing for their attention, and we have to hope that they will choose to enroll in English courses rather than in economics courses or etc. And whereas for example, in the British universities, in Oxford and Cambridge, or the provincial universities even, they admit the students apply to a particular faculty or department, and they are admitted to do English. So you don't have particular worries about students. Maybe you're not attracting as many candidates, so you can't select as well as you could in the past, where you would get better students, but at least the numbers are not a problem in those systems. Whereas ours is really very much a free market system, where they can attend an English course the first day and decide this professor is boring, so I'm going to go and attend an economics course instead, which might actually be more useful to me or something.
If you make your questions more precise and try not to make it an individual exchange.
They're precise.
Yeah, they've been precise, but yeah.
Thank you so much for the lecture. My name is Shanga. I just wanted to ask you, you ended your lecture with a quote from Derrida, and I was specifically hooked onto this phrase, that space of unconditional discussion without presuppositions. It seemed to me that you were actually trying to, the latter half of your topic, that the future of theory. So I thought you kind of pinned it on that is a space of unconditional discussion. So I just wanted to ask you, is that actually possible, that a space of unconditional discussion without any presupposition?
No, I think you're right. It's not once to get discussion underway, there probably need to be some presupposition. So I think the point that Derrida is trying to make is that it should be, in principle, you should be able to question any of those presuppositions, and that's certainly one of the major things that theory has done. And often theory, of course, is accused of being too self-reflexive, that you start questioning your own presuppositions or your colleagues. As soon as you say something, they say, aha, but you are presupposing X, which is dubious. And so the things often you feel you can't really get underway very well. It's really a call, that notion of the university without condition, is that this should be unconditional in principle anyway, research, where you are able to put in question any presumption and work on that, including the presumption, the notion of criticism itself. But no, I think you're right. It's not possible to have really a discussion without, if you don't presuppose anything. It's very hard to get started at all. You presuppose, for example, that something is worth investigating or something is worth discussing. You may decide at the end that it wasn't, but to get started, you have to presuppose an object.
Yeah, but I think there's another way of responding to that question. Because if you say that it's not possible to have a discussion without presuppositions, and then you're somehow saying that what Derrida said is not really, right. So I would like to go to one of your own articles. I think it's a beautiful article which you made part of one of your books, Presuppositions in Intertextuality. So then what you argue is, you explain what a presupposition is, I think in almost a major part of the essay, and then towards the end you say that this is finally what ends up being intertextual. So I think that's what Derrida means. I think intertextuality is unavoidable. It's not just a space of discussion, it's not just discussing without presuppositions. You can't say anything without presuppositions. You have to presuppose, and if you become a little more Kantian, you have to presuppose space and time to be around. Yeah, and when you say that there is. So I think it is in that sense, that's one thing, and I think intertextuality is unavoidable. That's the sense in which you look at presuppositions. But I would say that here, there is a more restricted sense in which you talk of prejudices, misconceptions and bias. I think we'll have to take it in that more regulated, controlled sense of the word presuppositions in the case of this culture.
Fair enough. Yes.
So you mentioned about how we can't negate the existence of a thing if you can't experience it. It doesn't mean that the thing doesn't exist. So I would like to know your views about the idea of God, because it's supposedly a creation of man with superhuman values to keep so that we could get more clarity to the understanding of a reality and put a pattern to it with man as the center.
Yes. Well, yes, it's not a topic I talk about very often, but push to answer, I would say yes. I do think of the concept of God as a human one created by man, and of course different religions have created different concepts of God or of the divine or divine power, and they offer both in some religions and in sort of an explanation, an account of some aspect of human existence and human history, and also promote certain kinds of values. Most religions seem not to have been very good at living up to the values that they claim to espouse, especially in the sacred texts. The institutions tend to develop rather on their own in connection with human needs, wants, desires, greed, etc. It's interesting. Derrida has written a fair amount about religion and is often accused of having taken a religious turn. He speaks sometimes of religion without religion, which is sort of can be very critical of religious institutions, but at some level, not critical of the religious aspiration or the aspiration to push beyond what is already known and humans what circumscribes the human space. But I have one of my most brilliant students ever is a man named Martin Hegland, who wrote a book called Radical Atheism, Derrida and the Time of Life, which has been very well received in the US, which argues that Derrida's thought, despite all these people who want to claim Derrida for a sort of mystical tradition or a religious tradition, his thinking is fundamentally a radical atheism, partly because of the demonstration that all the values to which, it partly has to do with an argument about the eternal or the non-temporal, etc., that everything that might make it seem, that we might appeal to in wanting to escape from time or death, etc., all the values that would be involved there are actually values that come from time and from human existence in time, so that the notion of eternal life or something is one that really makes no sense. That it's if you wanted eternal life, what you are really wanting is values that that are tied, in fact, tied to temporal existence and like Earth. So I'm more or less persuaded by Martin's argument in that book that Derrida's is a radical atheism, though it certainly hadn't occurred to me before.
Professor, thank you, Professor, for your enlightened talk. My concern is regarding the justice that you talked. In the post-human world, human beings have become an embedded, and we talk about the distributive agency of human beings. When we investigate on the question of justice, when we try to provide universal or planetary level of justice, the question is, we human beings conduct research and studies. My concern is, can we ensure justice in that sense? This is a concern, and how would we address this question in a post-human world?
No, it's a serious problem. Yes, I mean, Derrida has written about this in texts that are really often quite hard to follow, about the problem of justice, especially the distinction between justice and law, which are not the same, of course, and the thirst for justice, the drive for justice. But certainly notions of justice seem presupposed in these arguments about even in early Derrida, when the word didn't appear, when we're talking about the deconstruction of hierarchical oppositions. The underlying assumption and part of the appeal of those notions is that the upper the term that has been privileged has been in some sense unjustly privileged, not that it really harms writing to have been. In the case of speech and writing, you don't really think about justice. Whereas once you've got male-female or white-black or other of these oppositions, value-laden oppositions, and the attempt to undo that hierarchy does seem to be based on a desire for some kind of justice, equitable treatment, etc., and validity. But the question of where that comes from and how it is to be supported is a difficult one that I'm not really equipped to answer. But it does seem to underlie a great many things that we do, and gives some sense of justice. Resistance to the notion of the post-human, in fact. I mentioned, these lists of the things that bonobos, bulldozers, bugs, whatever, if we're supposed to care for them all equally. And there's a certain sense of justice that seems to be animating those theorists. They say we're treating these objects as if they were just there for us. But is that really the sense of justice that we want to believe in? And I'm not sure that that's the right sense of justice.
I have a question. When you were speaking about Jacques Rancière, we're talking about the regime of the aesthetic, new regime of the aesthetic. Is it the same as his notion of the distribution of the sensible, or is it something else?
No, they're certainly connected. Though I think that for him there's that the mimetic regime, the representational regime, which is sort of aesthetic theory prior to the time of the revolution, based on genres and what is appropriate in each genre, and what kinds of subjects, what kinds of language, things of that sort, where aesthetic evaluation takes place in terms of a set of norms, and then a sort of a shift to an expressive, we could call it, he calls it aesthetic, others would call it perhaps an expressive regime, where now it's no longer a matter of in the mimetic regime, the artist is above all a craftsman who is creating an object that is beautiful or well-made in conformity with the norms of that type of object. Whereas in this new romantic regime, we could call it a romantic regime, it's expressive. The artist is expressing something of him or herself, and language is, any subject is good, any language is possible, and so the criteria for judgment become different. So the distribution of the sensible is much more tied in with the questions of whose responses, whose perceptions are taken to be of value in what conditions. There's certain regime, part of the part of the ancient representational regime. There were only certain people who were qualified, as it were, to be artists and craftsmen, that their sensibility sort of counted in ways that other people's sensibility didn't. With the new, more democratic regime, there's a different distribution of the sensible. Distribution of the sensible is a sort of an obscure phrase, which
theoretical tools and parameters is enough to assess. We are facing through a cyber colonial world we are going through. These the parameters and the tools of theories are enough. Everyone who have a device such like a smartphone have become narratives and critics. Is the existing theories are enough? This is my question.
Theories and theoretical tools and processes can actually address the problems raised by new technology, especially digital technology. Is that it? Yeah.
We are facing a cyber colonialism.
Yeah. I think that's
cyber colonialism. Yeah. Well, I think probably not. I think there are certainly people like Catherine Hales and others who are working in this sort of technological domain of the post-human are attempting to do that. But I suspect, yes, as you say, there's cyber colonialism. It's not a phrase I've yet heard, but it's certainly a phrase that makes sense. So, of course, in the U.S., the cliche view of the person from India is that they all understand computers much better than we do, and that they are all technological whizzes and going to. And of course, there's also the great fear of China and the Chinese cyber. So yes, at least if it's technological imperialism, it may not. Cyber imperialism may not come from America. It might come from different regimes. And of course, it's Russian hackers who often seem to be creating problems in the States. So maybe it's a sort of revenge of other countries. Through the cyber weaponry makes it possible for them to take revenge, and even if they're lacking other kinds of forms of political power. But yes, I think you're right that some new theoretical frameworks will certainly arise in order to think about all these problems of the new media, a digital universe, which probably I can't even understand my phone, much less how the internet actually works. It seems totally mysterious. I have a student who works on this sort of thing, and she was interested in, apparently there are debates about the question of how much does the internet weigh, because even though this information is sort of completely sort of ethereal, still there is apparently some kind of measurable weight to the amount of information. So it's totally bizarre information to me.
I think
it has to be left for your generation to deal with all this.
Yeah.
Not my generation.
So just an observation, just to add to that. I think there is this question of what is usually known as the double bind. As you said, you need to use the telephone, mobile. You said you're not using the advanced features. I don't think 80% of people usually use the advanced features on any form, any technology. The question is, can we do without them? Don't you think this is another expression of the double bind, where the moment you engage with technology, human being, there's always a question of being colonized by the other. It all depends on individual subjectivity, choice, and so on. It's a question of a contingent encounter that you cannot avoid. And the consequences could be colonization, being colonized by the system, or you colonizing the system, like the hackers.
Yes. And now we're expected to, with the internet, students expect you to respond to them right away, and things of that sort. We're expected to answer emails quickly, and things of that sort. We're certainly colonized by our systems, which has become sort of part of us. Yes.
My question is that in India, especially, we become consumers of the theory created in America or other European countries.
Yes.
Is such theories are able to address the local problems, or should we promote some local theories also?
Well, I think you should promote some local theories. I do. It is I mean, India has certainly already, with things like subaltern studies, India has all the ways in which India has certainly already contributed to theories in the West. And that's just more of that should happen. I think it's partly, of course, it's facilitated by the fact that India has this long tradition of education in English, so that you are able to function in this world and don't have to be translated. But it's also true, of course, that many of the Indians who have contributed to theory most prominently are expatriate Indians who. Still, that's why I cite the subaltern studies group, which has not been expatriates for the most part. But it's understandable that they might want to, if they become prominent in the theoretical world, they might want to emigrate to elsewhere where they have greater scope and rewards for their activities. I'm struck by the fact that I've been to China, and of course we get many visiting scholars from China. China is this world power, this great who's going to take over the world someday, no doubt. Which, so far as I can tell, is not. They are entirely consumers of Western theories, and they have not produced theoretical discourses that they have exported. They may have theoretical formulations of their own internally, but and in principle they are positioned to do interesting theoretical work. For example, China is a society that was both colonized in certain respects at certain moments, and yet is a colonial empire of its own. I may not want to recognize that they are an empire, but they should have a particularly interesting and complicated vision of post-coloniality there, where they are both they're both a colonizer and a colonized, and that ought to be, in principle, lead to more interesting and complex theories. But I'm not aware that it has happened yet. But certainly, I think that within this increasingly globalized world, where ideas move more easily across boundaries with the internet and internet journals, and I don't know to what extent books that are published now digitally are easily available in India, but they're not. But certainly, it ought to be there ought to be fewer barriers to a two-way exchange of theories.
If I can add to that, I think there is also a larger question of, hegemony. I don't think the West is actually asking us to use their theories. And I don't think an American would actually be thinking of what kinds of theories are produced in Kerala when they actually think of applying them to their own. I think there is this so-called post-colonial, as post-colonial writers speak about this division of labor that has already been made. We are laborers. The West actually, there seem to be, we actually consider that they are the ones who've got the big ideas. I think Shiv Vishwanathan's notion of cognitive justice addresses the same issue. But how many of us actually are familiar with his theory? Says that there's no cognitive justice because we privilege certain theories and we work on those theories. For example, look at your own question. The first part is, why do we use their theory? The second part is, can we use their theories to understand ourselves locally? So the assumption is the same. Somehow we are beholden to them. I don't know, we look forward. I don't think it's another double point.
Yeah, I would just say that I think there is in the West, in the academy, at least in the U.S., enough people who are eager to criticize the Western hegemony, white male hegemony, things of that sort. That there might well be opportunities to welcome if they can discover that here is a theoretical development coming from elsewhere. Certainly in comparative literature, there's a big debate about the question of we ought to be not just teaching books from different countries, but we also ought to be thinking about how American literature, for example, is viewed and assimilated in other countries. That should be part of the comparative perspective. It shouldn't be simply a comparison. Comparisons should not all be undertaken from the point of view of the U.S. And the comparisons from the point of view of India should be part of comparative literature. So I think there would be an openness to such things if they were managed to make their ways make their way to conferences and things of that sort, if you have new theories that would put us in our place.
Sir, thank you very much for that quite enlightening. During the course of your lecture, you gave a list of path-breaking books. And among others, there is Orientalism. My question pertains to Orientalism. My question is Orientalism path-breaking because of the anti-Westernism attributed to it?
No, it's hard to say. I mean, path-breaking, I think, partly in a historical sense, that it certainly was the first major work to sort of raise this question of the orientalizing inclinations of Western scholarship to general consciousness, shall we say, whether that sort of opened up lines of debate, even though people will sort of argue with Said about some of the historical claims. But it's true, that's not really an area in which I've worked. I just cited that because it seems to me that's generally thought of as an important path-breaking work in identifying how in our treatment, how in Western treatment of other cultures, these cultures have been sort of minoritized. You're shaking your head in disagreement. Do you want to say would you please say, I would be interested in knowing what you think about Orientalism.
Yes, that's actually word of the 2005 edition of the Orientalism. In that book, Said claims that there is nothing anti-Western in this book, and he further says that he has been trying to get rid of the stigma of anti-Westernism attributed to him. Does that provoke my question?
If he made that claim, it's partly because he knows that it had been received as a critique of Western attitudes towards the East in various ways. So he may have wanted to say he wasn't really meaning to be critical of the West. So it's hard to see how he could not have meant that. Because partly that was what made it exciting and interesting. That here was, oh yes, my gosh, look at this, all this scholarship which we have taken to be serious historical and philological scholarship is in fact imbued with a certain ideology, has been imbued with certain ideologies.
So Professor has to do one more session in the afternoon. So I request the chair to conclude. He has got a question himself, so I'd like you to, that would be the last question, and we wind up this session, and we're supposed to be meeting here at 1:30. We will actually push it a little forward.
Chairing this session has a deep privilege to me from putting questions to him. Therefore today, I have to violate my code of conduct and put a question and wind up the session. The thing is that when towards the end of your talk, you said it comes to very disturbing notions like treating beings as things. Treating beings as things. In that case, human beings, non-human beings, inhuman beings, within human beings, whatever. All these things should be treated, even computer, my Italy, your dosa, this chapati, the chair, everything to be treated as things. Therefore, the universe is a web of things. The interconnection, much more than that, the interconnection of things, that is possible because the recently developed anti-anthropocentric theorist, more important, anti-anthropocentric theorist that may lead to the possible post-human world, and of course enabled by technology, isn't it? And there, my question is, okay, beautiful, and there, the theories of chaos, the existing, and I think your talk is very silent about it. That has contributed much more to the future impossible, possible, or possible, impossible possibilities. And those theories of chaos an inverted version would be chaos of theories, and their formative, conformative, transformative role in the formation of new humanities. And of course, her question, no, Derridian, no, advice without presuppositions we should think. I'm very sorry to say, and Derrida even now is dismissed without understanding him. We dismiss Derrida without understanding him. And there are the latest quantum mechanics theories. There are, I'm telling you, local presuppositions, unlocal presuppositions. The local presuppositions we can avoid. Now we more suffer from local presuppositions. Get back to your concept of corporate universities, where we suffer more from local presuppositions, but not unlocal presuppositions. That is essential. That is essential. Therefore, in knowledge making, in knowledge dissemination, in knowledge consumption, we should avoid local presuppositions. That is what Derrida means. But unlocal presuppositions may be there. They may be part of meaning making. They may be part of dissemination of knowledge. Therefore, this chaos theories, nowadays we treat chaos more as a positivistic term than as a negativistic term in the Arnoldian tradition. Therefore, what's its formative influences on the contemporary thinking? With that we wind up this session. Here I happen to be the chair as well as chairing myself.
We can stop there. I'm not well informed about chaos theory, but I'm happy to hear more about how it should function in this presentation. Thank you very much for your comment, and thank you for your questions.